All right, I'll stop reading the chat and start presenting. Welcome, everyone. So today I'll share some information about the State of CSS Survey, the latest edition. I'm Philip on the Google Chrome team. So what's this survey? This survey is a spinoff from State of JS to begin with. It's a community effort. It's been running for 3 years now. Sasha Grief is the survey maintainer, if you will, and has been doing this from the beginning. Sarah in the middle has been helping out this year with some accessibility issues, which I'll get to next. And then there's me giving feedback and trying to use the results for browser vendor prioritization mainly. So what I'm going to do is step through just some of the results that I found most interesting, and then at the end talk a little bit about how we're using those for an effort called Interop 2022. I should say also that the link here, the 2021.stateofcss.com, it's not done yet. The report isn't done yet. You can get all the results and analyze them yourself as a JSON dump or with an API. But you probably just want to wait for the full report to be done, unless you're really into this stuff. All right, and with that, I'll start looking at some of the specifics. So as I mentioned, we spent some extra effort on accessibility this year. This work was done by Sarah Fossheim, so huge thanks to Sarah. We have both some new questions about accessibility and also the accessibility of the survey itself, and the report, so the results viewer, if you will, has been improved. So just a few interesting stats from the survey about accessibility. 32% of the developers who took the survey reported having some disability status themselves, which is actually, I don't know what I had guessed. I hadn't guessed beforehand, but I don't think I would have guessed 32%. Another surprising, to me at least, stat, positively surprising, was this question about Arya attributes. So this is from lists of features people are asked if they know about them, if they use them, and so on. So this is just one of many for accessibility, and almost 80% using Arya attributes is more than I maybe would have guessed. It suggests that developers, at least 80%, do some extra work for accessibility. So that's great, and also means that I don't know, that there's, if the extra work you have to do to improve accessibility is small enough, then developers will do it. So I guess that's a positive for our ability to roll out improvements that come like via extras. Sorry, that was a bit convoluted. So that would solve for accessibility. I'll move on to 3 other things. First being pain points. This is where we asked developers to pick between 8 different things. The way these questions work, there's another one coming up. The way these questions worked, if you didn't take the survey, is like a soccer tournament, where you get 2 of these choices and you say which is your which one you struggle the most with, and then you go to semifinals and finals, so you end up with one that you have chosen as the you struggle the most with. I won't read all of the different options here, but for example, interactions, that was dealing with scrolling and hover states, and what happens when you touch the screen of your phone. So the result of that question was this: browser compatibility, not too surprisingly, ending up at the top. We've seen that in many previous surveys as well, and form element styling, I guess, also, so no big surprise. So I'll come back to these rankings at the end as well, and won't say too much more about them here. But moving on to browser compatibilities, or browser incompatibilities, I should say, which is how it was phrased in the survey. This is a space where we know there's a huge problem. If you just ask developers point blank, hey, tell me what kind of sucks, then by and large, you're going to hear a lot about differences between browsers, features not supported in specific browsers, and so on. So we added a question to this year's survey asking specifically if there are any CSS features that developers have difficulties using because of differences between browsers. Entirely as a free-form field. So no choices, but just let people say whatever they want. So this is a pretty typical response to that question. Like, grid, flex, SVG. Yes, there are lots of differences between browsers. So a lot of the responses were like that, just sort of generally confirming the issue or pointing to big areas that we've seen before come up in surveys. And then others were more specific. So I'll go through a few of the specific themes that came up with this question and just comment a little bit on each one. So this one I found interesting. This was at the top? One of the top. It's number one or number two. We'll see in a little bit. Was flex gap. So what's interesting about this one is we heard this feedback over a year ago in the MDN MDN browser compatibility report in that survey. So that's been prioritized, and FlexGap has shipped in all browsers as of, I guess, this spring with Safari 14.1, if I don't misremember. Yeah. So it's shipped everywhere. Some developers did acknowledge that and say, yes, I know it's shipped everywhere now, but I still have to support some older browsers. Or this one I found interesting, noting that even though it's shipped everywhere, if you can't feature detect it, it's kind of a problem. So what actually happened here? This is, I think, maybe mostly useful as feedback for what to do in the future if a property is sort of expanded to work in new contexts. So in the beginning, there was grid gap that controlled the gap between grid items. When the CSS working group wanted to add support for gap for Flexbox, that was renamed to just gap and made to work in both contexts. But support for gap and grid was shipped long before it was in Flexbox. So the property itself is supported, has been supported for a long time, and there's no way to detect if it's supported for Flexbox specifically. So as it is, without some pretty elaborate script workarounds, you actually can't detect support for FlexGap, and I think that just means that if you want to support any browser that doesn't support it, then you just have to avoid FlexGap. It's too late for this one, but maybe there should have been a FlexGap alias that was there just for the feature detection. It's something maybe we'll ask the CSS working group as again for the future, not because we can rewrite history here. Okay, moving on to another one that was a common theme was Subgrid. Now, FlexGap is already shipped. All the rest are things that are not in all browsers yet. So Subgrid was shipped in Firefox over 2 years ago now, and it isn't shipped in Chromium or WebKit. But it does keep coming up in surveys, and it did in this one as well. So Subgrid, maybe we don't need to get into what Subgrid actually is. This presentation will be too long. Yeah, you can look at the Chromium and WebKit tracking bugs. And yeah, the request is pretty simple. Please give us Subgrid. Another one that came up a fair bit is backdrop filter, which gives you, this is the inverse of the previous situation. This is supported in Chrome and Safari, but it's not supported in Firefox. So backdrop filter with blur at least gives you this kind of effect, the frosted glass kind of effect. That's pretty common. It's not in Gecko yet. And this hadn't come up in previous surveys that I've seen, and I think the reason it came up here is because backdrop filter was one of these features that the survey first asked developers, do you use this feature? Do you know about this feature? So probably that's why it was on developers' minds and came up here. Yes, Ian, yeah, Chris Harrelson has told me that there are differences between backdrop filter between Chrome and Safari that are not trivial. So yeah, it's to get interop on that would not just be a matter of Firefox shipping something, but I won't get into that. Frankly, I don't know what it would take. All right, moving along to the third and I hope last big theme here is Viewport Units. Again, this is not news. This came up very strongly in the MDM browser compatibility report. Sorry, I'm reading the chat. And it came up again here, despite, I would say, not being one of these features that developers were asked about. So it's difficult to get the right behavior you want on mobile of just filling the viewport sort of on initial load, and when you scroll and the address bar is hidden, and also when the virtual keyboard is shown and hidden. This is, as I said, not new. The CSS working group has discussed this, and it's led to a number of new units. So instead of just VH, meaning viewport height, we have SVH, meaning smallest viewport height, L for largest, and D for dynamic. And then also these same units for viewport width, and I think some other combinations. So this was just, I guess, a few days ago, implemented in Safari Technology Preview 135. Maybe it'll reach other browsers. But I think even then, there are some unsolved problems here. Notably, how virtual keyboard works is different between browsers still. Chromium treats it as shrinking the viewport. WebKit, or at least Safari iOS, it's more like an overlay. And although there is a virtual keyboard API, there's no CSS mechanism that I know of to sort of avoid being covered by the virtual keyboard. All right, so all of that taken together, if you sort of categorize all the responses, you end up with a ranking that's a little bit like this. So as I said, FlexGap is as at the top. We have a bunch of issues that have come up before, but some of them new. And I'll get back to this list at the end as well. I should say here before I move on that some of these are groups of issues that are closely related, like scrolling is about scroll, like if there are issues with scroll snap, that would be scrolling. If you have overscroll behavior, that would also be scrolling. Where I've only separated, the only thing I separated out there was scroll bars, because that seems kind of different. So I just want to acknowledge that depending on how you group things, you might end up with a different kind of ranking. This is not like objective truth. This was the best sort of categorization that I could come up with, and there you go. All right, moving along to another question of the survey about missing features. This is a pretty quick one. Again, in this tournament style, developers were asked to pick which features they would most like to be able to use. So that's future looking as opposed to backwards looking, as the browser incompatibilities bits tend to be. These were the options: container queries, parent selector nesting, color function, subgrid, browser support again, mixins and scoping. We had 8 things, so I think that's how we added browser support here. Might seem a little bit out of place. In any case, this was the ranking that resulted. Content queries being at the top was definitely no surprise. That was the case in State of CSS 2020, and fully expected that that would sort of win this game. Browser support being number 3 is interesting, I guess, and also interesting is that Subgrid is at the bottom of this ranking, but pretty high up on another question. So it really shows that depending on how you ask the question, what you compare things to, you end up with slightly different results, and putting those together into some guesstimate of how to prioritize is not a science, more like not guesswork either, but it's somewhere in between. Use some judgment as well. All right, that's everything from the results. So what are we going to do with these? There's an effort called Entrop 2022, which follows a similar effort that we're doing this year called Compat 2021, which we now renamed to Entrop 2021, or we're using both words. Last year, we picked 5 focus areas, and you recognize 4 of them at least from the top of some of these lists, because they were based on surveys last time as well. We picked 5 areas, and we defined a metric, and browser vendors have been at work driving up these test results all year long. And all in all, to summarize, everyone started at less than 90%, less than 85%, in fact, and now everyone has surpassed 90%. Hopefully, we'll get even further before the end of the year. You know, my summary is great success. So we want to do this again, and for next year, we have a different process, or I should say, we have a public process this time around. The proposals link here is to the repository where we're taking proposals. Well, I should say that the window of suggesting new things has strictly speaking closed. So now we're rather focused on evaluating the proposals. So we have a lot of proposals in, and here's where these lists come back. I just wanted to show that, you know, the alignment between the results and what we're suggesting for Entrop 2022 is pretty good. If you look at what pain points people have pointed to, like more than half of them are sort of impacted by Entrop 2022. Browser incompatibilities, even more so. You know, there we have a bunch of them already as part of the Compat or Entrop 2021 effort. And then a bunch of the others are suggested for Entrop 2022. And finally, when missing features, containing queries right there at the top is a natural candidate. I should say that Entrop 2022, it's not done. We need to sort of finalize what all the vendors can agree on before the end of the year, something in less than a month from now, sort of our deadline. There's no guarantee that all these things will be prioritized, but I bet you some of them will. And if you want to join in that discussion, use the proposals link in the previous slide. All right, and that's really all. We have, I guess, 5 or 10 minutes for discussion, and I'm sorry that the results page won't work yet, but it will soon enough, I hope. And oh, I made a mistake. Yes. So Miriam is saying that scoping and cascaders are pretty distinct. So yes, a little bit out of my depth. I read the description of scoping about being able to, I figured that was a connection, maybe not so much. All right. Ian is asking, did we get any signal in the free-form responses about performance issues? You know, why don't we try to have a look? I would say not much. but there's a spreadsheet. It's public. Here it is. I will present that. How do I present that? I guess I'll pick another tab. All right. What are people saying about performance? Nothing for browser incompatibilities. And accessibility features, which is surprising, maybe it's mentioned twice. Okay. Other CSS pain points. Composite layers performance is voodoo magic. Okay. And animation performance of many elements at the same time. Finally, other missing features, performance, and there's some there too. So yes, there's some signal, but it looks to me, like it's not pointing at very specific things. So yeah, there's that. All right. Feel free to type questions into the chat or join and make noise. Oh, okay. Rob is saying that I'm breaking up. I guess I can't do anything. Okay, Steven says, no, I'm not. So you two fight it out. Okay. All right. Nicole says, Nicole, I saw you join the room. If you wanted to ask something.
I was actually just saying that this is very validating because a lot of this is stuff that we're already working on or planning to work on next year. And it's not, I guess, not surprising because it matches previous surveys, but excited that we're going to be able to meet so many of these developer needs.
Yeah. Can I ask, was there anything that surprised you, Nicole? Or that's like, we're not doing this, why? Or anything like that?
Not straight off the bat, actually. The few things that were new were actually on our radar as things to research this coming year. So, yeah, in a good way, no surprises.
Yeah, I guess that is good in a sense. It means we're not too far off in what we were thinking before. But then, of course, when you run a survey, you hope to learn something new as well. Stephen is asking, what do you think about the lag in developer responses? So a not unreasonable view is that FlexGap is still a problem, even though from the browser end side it's done. So this is difficult. So it's very clear that there's a lag in not just perceptions. It's not just that news takes time to travel. It's also that developers have to support much older browsers than we care about. You would find if you go look at the one of the sheets here that a lot of people, still not insignificant, are still saying like IE is a problem. It actually shows here. But we're not really doing anything. We can't add features to IE, right? So the time lag is there. I think the best thing that could be done to address that is to make sure that browsers are updating as fast as possible. But this is, in the hands of device manufacturers, really, mostly. So I think that's a problem, but something we can still do, like even if we can't change the time it takes for developers to be able to adopt, we still need to do something to be able to learn what's on the what's coming up and not just a look in the rearview mirror. Because if we do surveys like this over and over and we address the issues, then like more and more we're going to be hearing about things we've already prioritized and fixed. And then how do we then get the good stuff out of the results? And that's difficult. I've made one attempt at that, asking in another survey, basically, we're prioritizing these 5 things. What things other than that do you think are important? And still, a lot of the responses were like, oh, one of those things actually, or something that didn't have a lot of signal in it. So that's a problem. Let's see. Jeremy was saying also, how long after browser vendors? Go ahead, Nicole.
Oh, I was going to say, one thing we're trying for that is actually, rather than talking to developers, we're talking to designers and asking them, what designs did developers say they couldn't build or they wouldn't work on? And in that way, we're sort of getting ahead of what might be sort of future things that folks would like to be able to do, but aren't even developer pain points yet because the developer just said, no, I can't build that.
Right. So do you think that's a way to sort of be, those might be things that don't even have a solution in CSS yet, but if we build them, then they would become, I guess, first browser compat issues, and then finally be able to be used by everyone.
Yeah, ultimately, I think the things that designers are asking for are some number of them will turn out to be the future of web design. And obviously CSS is very dependent on what designers are trying to do and want to do.
Right, yeah. So one thing I don't know if we have, I don't know if State of CSS asked if you're mainly a developer or a designer. So I don't know if what we reached was, I would have to guess this is mostly developers. Like if you're not a developer at all, then I don't think you could answer some of these questions. But I don't know what proportion are designers and developers versus doing just development and taking the design from elsewhere. I don't know, but if that question is in there, then maybe filtering could give us some signal. But anything we can do, like we only run this survey. Sasha only runs this survey once a year. It's just one signal. Any partner feedback or other surveys or talking directly to developers, all signals are valuable, and you sort of put them together and form a picture of what's sort of consistent with all the data we've seen, and use those hunches a little bit and judgment to see what seems sensible. We should wrap up now. I guess there are other sessions starting. And Jeremy, I'll read your question in the chat and maybe reply elsewhere. All right, thank you everyone for joining. I guess I leave the session to end it. Bye everyone. Thanks everyone.